Welcome, everyone. This is Danielle Sass-Burnett with NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. You're joining us today for our webinar called Measuring Energy Efficiency Savings in Real Time Enhances Program Performance. And we're very excited about the program that we have planned for you today with some outstanding speakers. Next slide, please. NARUC is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. We represent the state regulatory commissioners in all 50 states and territories. We regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. Next slide. And NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation is a team within NARUC that provides technical assistance to members across the country. We identify emerging challenges and connect state commissions with expertise and strategies to handle complex decision-making under their purview. As part of this, we operate programs and projects across numerous topical areas related to technology, electricity system transmission, cybersecurity, and other areas. Further, we build relationships, develop resources, and deliver trainings to our members across the country. And part of that includes the monthly webinar series that you're on today, the innovation webinars, which are open not only to members, but to all stakeholders and other interested parties. We're grateful to the U.S. Department of Energy for supporting this activity. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on NARUC's website because there are a large number of participants planning to join today. Everyone's going to be in listen-only mode. So please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel to send us your questions or comments at any point during the webinar. You are certainly invited to direct any question to a specific panelist or to all of the panelists. We are going to respond to questions at the end of each presentation and then again at the end of all three presentations. Next slide, please. So for today's webinar, again, we're really excited by the esteemed group of panelists we have today to talk about some real innovation in energy efficiency. And leading that group is going to be Commissioner Kimberly O'Gwynn, Commissioner from Arkansas. She joined the Arkansas Commission in 2016 and holds quite a number of leadership positions across NARUC as an organization. Very excited to have her to lead us through the program today. Thank you, Commissioner O'Gwynn, for being here. Please take it away.
Thank you, Danielle. Thanks, Danielle. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. In the U.S., smart meter installations has dramatically increased throughout this decade. The Edison Foundation reports 88 million smart meters, that's 70% of households, were installed in 2018, and its projected deployment will reach 108 million by the end of this year. Today's discussion is timely because it's important we leverage AMI technology to increase savings for our customers. Our panelists today each will provide their perspective and experience on how AMI can be optimized in regards to energy efficiency. Our panelists today include Carmen Bess, who is the Director of Policy and Emerging Markets at Recurve. In partnership with utilities, state agencies, commissioners, and advocates, she helps sow the seeds for demand flexibility to scale as reliable grid resource. She supports the consistent valuation of the impacts of demand-side interventions and accessible analytics to drive market-based decarbonization. Prior to joining Recurve, Carmen spent over 10 years with the California Public Utilities Commission, where she brought the findings and insights from evaluation to statewide energy policy through demand forecasting, integrated resource planning, and overall improvements in the deployment of energy efficiency. Thank you for being with us today, Carmen. Our next panelist, Ben Brown, is an expert program manager with PG&E's Energy Efficiency Portfolio Management Team. Ben manages the Pay for Performance pilot program in the portfolio's residential program sector and supports the further development and normalized meter energy consumption program implementation guidelines. Ben also leads the portfolio's integrated demand-side management implementation strategy and is working to integrate behind-the-meter energy storage and distributed energy resources into the portfolio's offering. Thank you, Ben. Mark Wyman is a Senior Program Manager for the Energy Trust of Oregon, responsible for developing pilot programs and new efficiency offers. These efforts include new and emerging spaces for energy efficiency, such as manufactured home replacement and meter-based pay for performance. Mark also serves on Energy Trust's internal innovation team and has been a resident of Portland, Oregon for 7 years, prior to which he lived in New York City, managing energy efficient programs for NYSERDA. Mark's personal interests include international travel and disappearing into remote pockets of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. One of those two are well suited for social distancing. The other, hopefully, will resume again someday soon. Thank you, Mark. And our first panelist will begin with Carmen. And as Danielle mentioned earlier, you can ask questions from each panelist. At the clarifying questions we'll take after each presenter, and then we'll have time additionally at the end. Carmen?
Great. Thanks, Commissioner Ogwin, and thanks, Danielle, for the opportunity to share today. Next slide. Like many of you, I'm sure you've been introduced to the finer points of homeschooling the last few months. And I, for one, have come to realize that grades aren't really telling me what I need to know. So I'm really becoming appreciative of the interactive platform that our high school has for looking at grades, because it helps me stay connected to what I really care about, which is that my daughter has been finishing her homework, that she's been understanding the material, and that she's making progress towards the grades that she'll be getting. You know, she's the one that's responsible to deliver, of course, but with this interactive platform, I can still keep an eye on it and understand how the grades are likely to progress and target interventions if I need it without major blow-ups at the end. You know, as regulators, I'm pretty sure you would appreciate that, you know, maybe 80% of the job in parenting and utility regulation probably comes back to knowing that you are watching, right? And it strikes me that this experience that I've had with report cards is kind of similar to where we're at in regulating energy efficiency these days. Right now, most of you probably find out about how programs did at the end of a program cycle, or maybe even a couple years after the cycle. And it comes so late that there isn't really much you can do, or the utilities can do about it, except bicker a little, or if you're in California, bicker a lot, and then pick up the pieces and try again. And what I'm seeing is that change can really come about when you implement some of the key components that surround meter-based efficiency. Those are adopting standard weights and measures, which allows you to consistently track meter-based impacts, creating performance accountability to align the incentives, and adopting frameworks for competitive procurement that bring in greater investment. So just like that report card platform with my daughter, meter-based efficiency as a concept and all the tools that go around it help you concentrate on the things that matter most. Next slide, please. And the things that matter most are really changing in our systems today. You are adapting to this reality, as well as all the other vendors, with a wide range of energy resources available and a myriad of business models that are willing and able to deliver. You're devising regulations and policies to match the challenges and also open the opportunities, and it's messy. Next slide. And Recurve's platform, therefore, is kind of like my daughter's report card platform. It helps clean out some of that messiness and helps connect and organize the myriad of actors to data that provides a common understanding of performance and thereby facilitates transactions in the market. And it all kind of starts with the concept of standard weights and measures for quantifying impacts at the meter. Next slide. Because consistency and transparency is a key value proposition for meter-based efficiency. We all know that old adage, a penny saved is a penny earned, right? Well, it's a common unit that we all understand. But would you say the same for a kilowatt hour? Do you have trust that a kilowatt hour saved or shifted or shaped is equal to a kilowatt hour generated? My guess is probably no. Next slide. Because
This is how we tend to define a kilowatt hour saved. It's a pile of reports from evaluations that are conducted years after the programs are implemented. Or perhaps this is what your technical reference manual looks like. It's a long list of technologies with their backed up engineering calculations that can deliver savings today. But in either case, this is the equivalent of that flat report card result that I was talking about. When this is your primary means of feedback, it reinforces the compliance nature of energy efficiency programs in the regulatory space, as opposed to optimizing them to deliver as a resource. Next slide. And I've observed that folks don't settle for that with other distributed resources, and I don't think you have to settle for that with energy efficiency either, especially when you've invested in infrastructure to provide hourly information about what is happening at the meter. In order to optimize energy efficiency resources in relation to grid operations and bridge with customer needs, you really do need to have a consistent, transparent means of tracking the impacts at the meter. Next slide. And that's why CalTRACK and the OpenEEMeter were created. CalTRACK provides a standardized, detailed method for calculating changes in consumption due to interventions that happen behind the meter. They're built on industry best practice. It's a pre-post regression analysis that's normalized by weather and occupancy. It's empirically tested and it's peer-reviewed. The hourly methods, for example, are an adaptation of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab time of week and temperature model. And then the methods are operationalized in the OpenEEMeter, which is an open source code base that allows for transparent, repeatable calculations at scale. And since it's open source, it's available without restriction. And these projects are maintained through a collaborative community of market actors, from implementers to analysts to utilities and software vendors, via the Linux Foundation's focused effort on energy called LFE. Next slide. And what the Recurve business model does is it offers a software platform that provides a scaled execution of the CalTRACK and OpenEEMeter revenue grade calculations, and augments that with a fully auditable record of each transaction and the impacts for every site in the portfolio and also in aggregate, which in turn allows our clients, who are program administrators, implementers, and regulators, to forecast and track the performance of these resources in relation to the grid. Next slide. And oh, I missed a slide in there, but I'll move to the next. So when our vendors or when our clients are able to do this, it helps them consider technology agnostic and integrated paths for demand flexibility. So they can answer the question of, how did these things behind the meter affect demand relative to the forecast? What was that effect on an hourly and in a locational basis, rather than the rather flat question of, did we meet our annual savings goal? It's kind of the equivalent of me asking my daughter, did you get your assignments done on time and did you understand the material, rather than did you get an A or a B? So adopting a standard weights and measures framework for meter-based quantification across distributed energy resources, I think, is a must-have, and it's a key to scaling efficiency specifically for the future. Next slide. But to get there, you have to start where you're at, right? So using meter data to review past performance is that first tier, bottom of the stack, no regrets step that you can take. Understanding past performance at the meter helps to identify opportunities to improve programs. Easy as that. Moving up from that, tracking the meter-based impacts as part of the program deployment offers actionable intelligence to optimize programs as you go. And it also gets folks ready for the next step, which is to implement pay-for-performance style programs with a better understanding of how it might work and where the value lies. And that also really helps align incentives. And from there, market actors can really be ready for a full-scale competitive procurement model to finance and rely on energy efficiency, more like we do with power purchase agreements. Next slide. So back to the first point on the ramp. If you were to do nothing more than review past programs on a metered basis, you could significantly improve your cost effectiveness without even changing program designs. Just targeting the right customers that would benefit from programs in the next time around. And when you go up one tick on that path and start tracking the meter-based impacts as you go, you enable aggregators and administrators to manage risk across the population and optimize the interventions within the population to deliver the best outcomes that are possible, be that on a cost effectiveness basis or other valuation framework. So as a regulator, when you can use these tools to track the whole portfolio, it neatly synergizes with your obligations to optimize ratepayer investments and offering a clear understanding of how these investments in efficiency are affecting the system. Next slide. So in progressing beyond these two no-regret steps, California provides one example of taking meter-based efficiency to the next level. Normalized metered energy consumption, NMEC, as we call it in California, was adopted via statute in 2015, and it sparked a significant recasting of the structure of efficiency. Yet we're still working through some of the details. But the key change in the legislation was focusing our goals on changes in consumption that are quantified at the meter, rather than just achieving savings incremental to code. So in response to this legislation, the Commission's regulations have included lots of things, including authorizing pilots, having specific rules for program implementation, and they also took the opportunity to link it with some of their other objectives to have greater third-party administration within the energy efficiency portfolio. And since third parties was an emphasis, it gave them an opportunity to amplify some of these elements of performance accountability, which was also cited in the legislation. The CEC has also adopted concrete strategies to incorporate meter-based analysis and aggregations in their planning functions and responsibilities so both agencies can synergize around the impacts on the load forecast and make a path for doubling energy efficiency as directed in the legislation. This aggregation piece is a key part of the solution, which is why the CPUC and the CEC have put an emphasis on population NMEC. Next slide, please. The rulebook on population NMEC sets an expectation for aggregated meter-based programs that become the preferred path given the value they bring in reducing the regulatory burden of analyzing each site M&V plan. Population NMEC in this guidance gives quite a lot of flexibility to program implementers in exchange for the consistency in the tracking and monitoring structure, back to that standard weights and measures things I was talking about. And some really interesting innovations are emerging as a result. The PUC also adopted in this ruling, or in this guidance, a threshold requirement that 50% of the payment to aggregators in a meter-based pay-for-performance program must be tied to the savings, which takes us one more tick up on that path of scale that I was talking about, which is embracing performance accountability. Next slide. So the CPUC recognized this in the rulebook that performance accountability is what really aligns incentives between the actors. When you have flat incentives, you're being paid for getting the maximum installations with minimum cost. When you're paid for what you deliver at the meter, the highest reward goes to those with maximum performance, and they're motivated to do quality work to deliver on the actual results at the meter, which also creates important connections within the market, as illustrated here, to incorporate outside financing and new risk management structures that also reward innovation and help grow the pie overall, rather than fighting over limited ratepayer dollars. Performance accountability also allows regulators to focus on outcomes and not dilly-dally with every measure that could possibly be installed. which is kind of a fundamental shift in how we approach oversight, because you are paying for what you get, not just for what you plan. Next slide. And paying for what you get as opposed to paying for what you plan looks a lot more like the arrangements we rely on for power purchase agreements, i.e. competitive procurement. So we made it to the last stop on our path to scale. When you're measuring at the meter and have performance accountability built into the system, you also open the opportunities to finance energy efficiency, at least the resource acquisition component, more like we do with traditional infrastructure. And when we use leveraged project finance, we don't have to rely quite as much on the ratepayer funded efforts to meet these really ambitious climate and system challenges. So thanks, last slide. Thanks for climbing the curve of scaling efficiency with me. I think if you keep these 3 key policy transitions in mind, wherever you might be starting in this process, remember that adopting standard weights and measures helps you consistently track meter-based impacts. Creating performance accountability will help you align incentives, and adopting frameworks for competitive procurement will help bring in greater investments. As regulators, you play a key role in ensuring energy efficiency can bring value to the grid and to customers, and you are invaluable in keeping all of us focused on what matters most.
Thank you, Carmen. Do we have any questions as we transition between Carmen's slide and Ben's?
Nothing came through on the chat box, so we'll just invite everybody to please submit your questions via chat and we will get to them.
Okay, well, we'll move right along to Ben. Ben, thank you. You can begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner Oakland. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Brown, and I'm from Pacific Gas and Electric Company over here in California. As mentioned, I sit on the company's energy efficiency portfolio management team. In the residential sector, I manage our pay for performance program. And I'm happy and I have the pleasure to talk to you about some of our experience in those programs so far, as well as the next steps we'll be taking through our portfolio solicitations to procure ever increasingly innovative program types. Next slide. So before I begin giving a bit of a background on the programs themselves, I wanted to just offer this slide for some history of energy efficiency in California in general. It has quite a long storied history beginning back in the 1970s, originally relying on building and appliance codes to drive savings. Since then, it's evolved into a $1 billion a year ratepayer-funded portfolio of programs across the investor-owned utilities. The portfolios run by each program administrator are required to be cost-effective from the ratepayer's perspective, and the program varieties have increased substantially to include not just the building and appliance codes, but of course the delivery of programs using upstream, midstream, downstream models, and of course, as we'll see here, some innovative program models with pay-for-performance approach. Next slide. So one of the most important aspects of the California electricity market and the risk that our energy efficiency portfolios manage to really is depicted here. I think this graphic has become quite famous or infamous, depending on how you view it. This is a typical spring day, as it mentions, in the California electricity market, showing the price differences for the cost of electricity. And as you can see, we call it the duck curve. And as you can see, in the middle of the day, the energy costs are quite suppressed. This is due to the ever-increasing adoption of distributed generation within the state. Customers are purchasing and installing solar photovoltaic systems and becoming self-generation sites. And so the cost of electricity as a whole has significantly gone down, obviously, when those systems are up and running. Then, of course, in the evening time, after the sun is no longer shining and these systems are no longer generating electricity, the demand is still there, or even increased really, and the distributed generation systems are no longer able to supply the needed capacity. Next slide. So that graph, the duck curve, can actually be mapped in a more finite fashion, in a more detailed fashion rather, onto the graph I've depicted here. As you can see, I've used 2020 and 2030 as a comparison to show how the electricity market and the pricing really does change. But both the last slide and this slide are really meant to offer everyone here a depiction of where the needs for generating energy efficiency, where the needs for managing our demand-side management programs lie. And it really is to ensure that the investments we're asking our ratepayers to make are happening at the times of the day that yield the greatest return. And so between 2020 and 2030, you can see, well, the evening peak in terms of price is a little above $300 for the evening hour. However, in 2030, we can see that there's a lot more evening hours that are up there in substantial price points. And it is incumbent on PG&E and the other program administrators in the state to ensure, again, going back to my earlier slide, that we administer and implement cost-effective programs. And to do so requires us really to drive the energy efficiency investments to these particular times of day. Next slide. So, as Carmen also mentioned before me, there are many pieces of legislation that allowed us to get to the point where we can offer the pay-for-performance programs that I'll talk about in the next slide. I won't necessarily go into great detail here, but suffice it to say that these pieces of legislation and policy were key in both allowing us to solicit for the pay-for-performance programs and request ratepayer funding to administer them, and then using the last piece, the last component on this slide, the California Public Utilities Commission decision actually asked us to take it a step further and use our energy, or take our energy efficiency portfolios out to the market to solicit for third-party designed and implemented programs across the portfolio. And so that is really one of the next steps that allows us to expand on a singular sort of pilot program model, as I'll discuss here, and take it to a more wider portfolio approach. Next slide. Well, this is a nice little chart I like to offer for a quick description of the pay-for-performance program model. If we start in the top left, we have our program implementation partners, those energy efficiency companies and contractors who are out in the field installing and working directly with our customers. And so, it starts with them, obviously, finding customers for whom they wish to make an energy efficiency investment, both the customer and the implementer, or engaging in a behavioral or operational type of program. And the impact of those programs, will be measured at the actual PG&E meter. So rather than relying on prescriptive savings ascribed to individual measures or widgets in advance, we've instead asked that the implementers work directly with our customers to devise pretty much a tailored energy efficiency strategy, a strategy that will allow the customer to see utility bill savings and will generate an investment return for the ratepayer-funded programs. So those metered savings obviously are fed back to PG&E, and they are used in our contract structure, our performance contract structure, to pay the implementer only for those savings that we were able to measure. The last key point I'll make here is that this highlights a significant shift in the program model here, where there is an increasing amount of risk displaced from the ratepayer to the implementer, again, hand in hand with sort of throwing by the wayside prescribed values and a and a discrete list of energy efficiency measure opportunities. We've instead asked the implementers to work with our customers on things that would generate savings, and indeed they have that incentive aligned with them because the contract structure only rewards the implementers for being able to generate energy savings. Next slide. So I wanted to offer this slide as a depiction of really the variety of program types, both measures and intervention types that we've seen in the programs we have so far. So PG&E has in our residential pay for performance pilot program, we have 4 sort of sub-programs implemented by 3 different implementers. And what was a very rewarding part of soliciting and procuring and implementing these programs is the innovation that these implementers brought to market. We've seen these implementers adopt new technologies that had not been, that hadn't been around long enough to have even had any research and prescribed savings values assigned to them. We've seen our implementers incorporate behavioral and operational regimens, either in a standalone fashion that can be actually delivered remotely, which has come in quite handy in a shelter-in-place environment. And we've seen that they've coupled that with some energy efficiency investments and, really made a concerted effort to have all of these pieces of the program work together. And again, this was really enabled by throwing off the need to rely on a discrete list of prescribed measure savings and instead ask that the implementers, both make an investment and work with customers to make investments on things that can materially impact their energy usage. Next slide. So as I mentioned, maybe not enough, but we are, it's a pilot program, the Pay for Performance program is. We have been running with our 4 programs, our 3 implementers for a couple of years now, and we are looking to increase customer participation to the point where we can conduct an evaluation. To Carmen's point earlier, of course, we do have the luxury of having very real-time feedback, which I get into here in a minute. However, we are leaving it in the pilot phase for the short term, with hopes that it can expand to a more portfolio-wide solution in the future. So the successes, obviously not to be diminished, was really the fact that we were able to, we were afforded the luxury of having the legislation that allowed us to run a solicitation, and we received very positive responses to that solicitation. As I mentioned, we do have our implementers running in the field right now. And 2 of the contracts with our implementers actually do contain variable pricing, going back to one of my earliest slides where I depicted the need to ensure that energy savings occurred in the evening peak. These contracts actually do specifically reward in an enriched fashion savings that are generated during those peak times. As I mentioned in the past couple of slides, we have seen in a very innovative implementation, both with the suite of measures selected or the types of interventions offered, but certainly also with the type of feedback that we're providing to our implementers and how they're incorporating that and pivoting their programs to address what they're seeing based on the CalTRACK measured meter-based results. Of course, as a pilot program, it is also incumbent on us to identify challenges that we need to overcome, and the forefront of which is really the distributed energy resource landscape and the increasing landscape in California. So we're seeing many of our residential customers or an increasing number of our residential customers are adopting behind the meter solar. They're adopting behind the meter battery storage and installing electric vehicle charging stations. If it's not already apparent, these are challenges for us because we initially would rely on the meter and the consumption or lack of consumption of electricity on that meter to tell us how our program is faring with our customer. Obviously, these other aspects, given that they sit, or these other DERs, given that they sit sort of outside of energy efficiency, throw a little bit of a confounding variable that we need to address, right? We would not want to attempt to take credit for reductions that were really due to a customer installing distributed generation at their site. The last couple of points here, I really just want to say, discussing and ensuring that our implementers are properly aware of their compensation model and what's expected of them in terms of making an investment up front that may not offer return unless they have confidence in the savings that they're going to be generating is a bit of a new type of model, especially when they're dealing with smaller independent contractors to work in the field. So that's a conversation that we know has to be had with implementers and is an important one to keep in mind as these programs roll out more widely in other jurisdictions and even in our portfolio. And then I'll say also, given this new type of program, we need to ensure that there's a cost and benefit reporting structure that can accommodate it. Next slide. So I'll go quickly. I want to keep us on track here. The program goals, obviously, as I mentioned, are to make sure that this is a sustainable model for the EE portfolio, the energy efficiency portfolio, and to dovetail into my last two slides, we believe that this can, as a next step, allow energy efficiency to emerge as a reliable distributed energy resource and as a grid resource. Next slide. So the PG&E and actually across the California investor-owned utilities, we are procuring new energy efficiency programs for our EE portfolio. And one of the aspects of this solicitation, this RFP that we've included, was to ask that grid resource, or to ask bid to include whether or not they can sufficiently provide resources as sort of a distributed energy resource on par with what we're seeing out of other DERs like solar PV or behind the meter storage. So we've asked them to include whether or not the program can provide verifiable savings at specific locations using predictable times. Obviously, the magnitude is important, and what the availability of it is, how quickly they can how quickly they can offer this resources, and what assurance they have surrounding it. Next slide. And so really, this was to ensure that these programs, these energy efficiency investments, can compete on par with other DERs, as I mentioned. So requirements were that they include a meter-based approach with near real-time embedded measurement and verification. Obviously, that's key, as Carmen had mentioned. And that they incorporate both the customer data feedback they're getting and the grid data that we would be providing to them to ensure that they're delivering these solutions at the right time and in the right fashion. Next slide. And finally, this last slide is just to depict that, California is quite a large state with lots of varied terrain. And so the grid resource needs of California are significantly varied depending on where an energy efficiency, ideally a DER investment, is being made. So in the solicitation, we asked that the bidders, the responders, be conscious of these differences. I went kind of quick at the end, but this was an eye chart anyway. This was my last slide. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ben, for that presentation. And thank you to our attendees who submitted several questions. We want to make sure that we have time to listen to Mark's presentation. But I want to ask one clarifying question that came through. The question is, are there particular EMV concerns with paper performance, including net to growth questions such as that sometimes come up with a conventional EE program?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Sure, we anticipate the need to factor in a net to gross value. In California, in our we were prescribed 0.85 net to gross value for the program. However, we will look to, in a traditional evaluation, determine whether or not that's appropriate. We think it can actually be higher than that, meaning a higher net value. And we feel that way because the program being delivered, again, has a partnership offered with the customer that's not a limited engagement. So we wouldn't expect the customer to, or we may expect the customer to respond with, well, sure, I might have installed a particular appliance. Mine was going on the out. But in this program, with such an ongoing engagement model, we feel like it's appropriate to, or we feel like it may be appropriate to say that, well, these customers had a comprehensive energy solutions partner with them, and as a result, these net savings really are robust.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Now we'll move to our last presentation, Mark.
Yes, hello. So I will try and gallop through here so that we can have time for discussion at the end. So just jump on to the next slide if you would. So a little bit about Energy Trust of Oregon. We're a standalone not-for-profit. We have an operating agreement with the Public Utility Commission in Oregon to serve the customers of the investor-owned utilities in the state. Germane to this conversation, we also have a data sharing agreement where we import monthly data from 5 utilities, gas and electric independent utilities, and bring that all together to support evaluation exercises and programs such as this. Next slide. This is going to walk through our approach here. It's very much in the spirit of trying to learn and do the job with the tools that you have, recognizing we don't yet have the ideal conditions. I'd say we're sort of in the middle of the pack nationally in terms of AMI deployment. So we opted to go ahead and move forward, working with monthly data and also utilizing CalTRACK as the foundation for the savings methodology. In addition to what Carmen represented, the value to us was also that it presents an opportunity to share some of the infrastructural costs with other programs around the nation. And as a smaller state, I think there was more people in my former home borough of Brooklyn, all of Oregon. I have a long-term dream to link markets for energy efficiency together that I think when we talk about activating private equity as a smaller state, enabling our market to link together with larger markets, I think would be an important piece of the puzzle. Next slide. So we are now in the first year of a 2-year deployment. The approach that we're taking here is we did not go out with a bid. It is, meter-based pay for performance. We've selected 3 contractors, trade allies who are the ones who deliver services to customers as our participants. But the program is somewhat invisible to the customer. They still get the same offer they normally would. And we're doing that by essentially layering the performance part onto the deemed measure savings. So in year 1, we would claim the deemed value. And then in year 2, we would aggregate together in a portfolio and look to see overall, did that portfolio exceed the deemed value? And if it did, we pay out on a per therm or kilowatt hour basis for performance in excess of the deemed value. Next slide. Maybe I'll leave this as reference later on, but this is just sort of an illustration of how that works and move forward in the spirit of time here. We've established 3 portfolio types by treatment type. Next slide. Part of what that helps us do as well is come up with a sense of what the measure life will be for the portfolio, and that's an important piece to pricing the savings. We price the savings based on the avoided costs that we get from the Public Utility Commission, and then you apply those first-year savings to the life of the treatment. And so knowing what's going into the portfolio helps you come up with that advanced price signal, which was a question that came up earlier. And a lot of what we're trying to do is influence targeting behaviors. so that the value to the system is more aligned with the value that our business partners are deriving from participating in our program. And so we have been interviewing sales staff, technicians, to document their assumptions around what they think works. And we have dashboards set up so they can monitor their progress. And as the portfolios close, our hope is that they apply what they've learned forward, and we begin to see better and better realization rates. Next slide, please. So I won't go through all of the research questions here, but I think one that's important to me personally is whether or not this approach creates an opportunity to serve lagging segments of the market or underserved populations. When you take a population-wide approach to establishing a deemed savings value, as say 75% of that market receives a given treatment, your overall baselines will start to rise and measures may become less cost-effective or even drop out of the portfolio. And I've always been troubled with, well, what happens to those people that didn't participate? There may be deeper reasons why the programs weren't accessible. And now that sort of value of the savings on a deemed basis reduces, and you have less of a lever to serve those customers who, in principle, may actually need more support to participate. And as I mentioned before, we are really interested in how this influences contractor behavior and site selection, as well as cost effectiveness. Next slide. So as Ben alluded to there, we tried to go forward with a program that was workable, and we kind of punted on some of the more difficult questions. So we've excluded sites with solar, true to the CalTRACK data sufficiency requirements. Sites that have missing records would be excluded. And we also decided not to get into the game of healing non-routine events by adjusting either the baseline or the performance period. We're just using the results as they are. And the only adjustments we're making are weather normalization. And then at the end of the portfolio, we're running a comparison group analysis, which is a fortuitous decision in this current climate where there's massive exogenous effects to consumption occurring on account of the change in occupancy patterns with stay-at-home orders. And we do have fuel neutrality rules that govern all of our programs. And so fuel switching is not something that we're able to engage with this program. Next slide. So from where we are now, some things that we decided early on that maybe we would reconsider. We did not present to our partners sort of cleaned list of customers who would qualify. And so now, with our first portfolio closed, the attrition rate out due to some of these issues here is higher than we would have wanted it to be. So we're working on addressing that. And that's probably a longer conversation. Another thing to think about in the policy arena, measures that have market baselines, and Carmen touched on this a little bit. When you take a pay for performance or meter-based approach, it essentially makes everything what we would call an existing condition baseline, meaning that you're measuring against what happened in the 12 months prior, as versus, for a given appliance, the delta between whatever the code or market baseline is. Everything becomes an existing condition baseline. So comparing how your measures perform in the two different program structures is not exactly apples to apples. And I think we're sort of pushing up against some of the long-held practices around attribution to utility programs. And I'm hopeful that this will maybe kind of encourage some conversations around whether or not it's more important to know what actually happened or what you can parse out as attributable to a utility program. But we just sort of decided to move forward acknowledging that there was that vagary there. And it is a little challenging to forecast the yield out of these programs. When we close our first portfolio, and on to my last slide, we'll have a better sense of what that looks like. We are closing our first portfolio in the fall. I'm seeing a little bit of a lag. If you could move forward, I don't know if you did, and I'm not just seeing that, but click to the next slide, please. There we go. So yes, we are closing out the first portfolio in October. So we'll have our first tangible results, which is very exciting. Pursuing this type of program model, we did a lot of work prior to that April 2019 launch. And then you're just sort of hanging out, waiting to see what happens. and it will be very exciting to get those first results, and we're going to publish a public evaluation report on what we learned, what we're changing, and hopefully that'll be helpful to others in the industry. So I'll wrap it up there, just so we have time for Q&A. I think my contact information may be on the last slide, and certainly happy to answer questions later on. The grapes there are just an analogy for you have to just wait and see what happens with this year's vintage of efficiency projects. And so we're looking forward to getting results, and I guess I'll turn it over for the Q&A portion.
Thanks, Mark. We do have a couple of questions for you. The first question is, how do you target customers? And in that question, let me also ask for you to elaborate on data privacy issues when targeting customers. And also, do you have access to the utilities data on who are the energy hogs that might produce the biggest bang for your buck? Are there any customer privacy issues with this? Well, I could have read it all before I asked you my own question. And how cooperative have the utilities been in allowing you to access the data?
Yeah, so we have previously established agreements, sort of jointly, us and the regulators and the utilities and the regulators, to allow for the monthly data. And, we put a lot of work in the early years of our organization to joining these different point of delivery identifiers so that we can look on the gas and the electric side, two separate utilities, and see what's happening at those sites that have both fuels. When customers participate with us on our standard terms and conditions, it releases their information for use and evaluation purposes. But if they haven't participated, our use of that data, even though we have it, is kind of subject to different restrictions. We can't outreach to a specific customer and say, we see that your usage is high and we think you would be a good candidate for X or Y treatment. We can go on sort of a district-wide basis, and if we notice kind of trends in a given kind of zip code or town or portion of the state, we do direct our marketing campaigns to address certain relevant treatments there. But to this question of handing over to the contractor sort of actionable leads based on their load profile, that's outside of what we can really do, again, because those are customers who haven't participated with us and sort of consented to the use of their information for evaluation purposes and other kind of follow-up messaging and support. What we could do that we didn't do was at least go through and see, well, who has issues with their records, or was there an account changeover in the last year where you had a couple months of non-occupancy at the house? That I think that we could do to at least sort of clean the list a little bit. And we may consider that moving forward because we have a relatively higher level of attrition in terms of projects submitted and those that drop out for data quality issues than we wanted to see. So we're reconsidering what we did there. We were really hoping to sort of, over a longer period of time, encourage the contractors to do their own learning, because, of course, the consumption records are really strong indicators of outcomes or predictors of outcomes. But there's other things that they know when they go and visit the site that I think that they could use to determine a higher or lower performing site. With the deemed savings, kind of orthodoxy, you're really putting a value signal on quantity over quality because they're all priced and valued the same. So I think that's part of the sort of shift that we're trying to encourage here. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We have about 6 minutes left, and we have a few questions that have come in. This next question is for Ben. Ben, how do you determine the amount paid for performance? Can you share the specifics of your program in a short fashion?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I'm getting ready for these responses offline. So the compensation rates were competitively solicited, and our review and determination on that solicitation took into account not just the absolute compensation dollars requested by the bidder, but also obviously the overall cost effectiveness of the program using the total resource cost test. So a long-lived investment in an appliance, if coupled with a more rich compensation request, may still yield the best cost effectiveness program versus a shorter-lived investment with a lower compensation rate. The specifics of the program, the actual compensation rates, we hold internal to maintain market competition. However, there are some filings, such as the overall program's budget and our approval advice letter, which offer the ceilings of compensation we would be willing to entertain through that solicitation, and I can offer that.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Our next question is for you also. Do you support inclining block rates as a means of having excessive consumption pay for excessive use?
Also, a very good question. So as I was preparing the response, I was thinking to myself, I may need to pull in a colleague of mine at the company. I will say though, the programs are energy efficiency funded, and as such, we are required to demonstrate energy reductions. We can support use cases where there is load shifting, but it has to be coupled with an overall energy reduction. So we can't compensate energy use increases, which would obviously be a form of a load shift, without there being an overall net decrease in the customer's consumption.
Thank you. And we have another question that's asking about COVID-related issues. It seems like changes in residential load profiles post-COVID-19 could actually help flatten the duck curve by increasing residential consumption during the day and spreading the peak consumption throughout all hours of the day. Has PG&E been looking into the potential long-term impacts from COVID-19 on demand?
This question extends well beyond my small program in the corner of the enterprise. But yes, I can say most certainly we've been looking at the impact that this has both on the energy markets as well as our demand side management programs as a whole. I may unfairly ask Carmen to chime in if she wishes, as I know our partner Recurve has been looking at this as well. I will say though, it's still active and very much in consideration, and particularly from my seat in the company, how to properly calculate and compensate, indeed, performance-based contracts for energy reductions in this very odd environment.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes left, and we're going to try to end this on time, but in case we run over, we'll just maybe 2 or 3 minutes over our 3 o'clock end time, if that's okay with you all. The next question, I guess, Carmen, if you don't mind, we'll start with you. Are there any particular EMV concerns with paper performance, including net to gross questions such as that sometimes come up with conventional EE programs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it has 2 key components to it. One is that there's a lot of a bulk, I would almost assert, of the impact evaluation activities that you'd see in kind of a traditional evaluation are happening as you're deploying the program. So as long as you have a means to kind of transfer that information to the evaluators, they get kind of a leg up on starting that activity. There's other programs wherein we've built in comparison groups, so you can be looking at the selection of the population that looks like the participants to net out, as it were, the incremental impacts of the program. And then farther down that line, we also have one other example where we're doing a randomized control trial. It's for a behavioral program that requires such, but this one's designed as a P4P. So the long answer is yes, there are ways that we're doing that. I don't think that there's inherently more sticky issues for evaluation. I find that more of it falls in how you're categorizing the savings claim versus an evaluated savings result, and different jurisdictions have different kind of rules and regs around how those play out and who is accountable for which. So it's a little bit of semantics, but nothing on the methods.
Yeah, great. One more question before I have one last question from Mark. Have you received any resistance from utilities with the pay-for-performance programs?
Yeah, I think one of the, as I've been sharing these insights in lots of different audiences, I think there's kind of two things that typically come up. One is a fear that by doing pay-for-performance, you're giving a little too much of that customer relationship away to a third-party aggregator, and that might not feel very well aligned with some of the customer engagement strategies that have been used in the past. But my response to that would be you're still very much in control about who is running those programs, and it's kind of a choose your own adventure in terms of which sorts of solutions you think are going to be matching well with your customers. And folks are still doing a lot of co-branding and things like that are very familiar within existing program implementation partnership models. I think the other piece of challenge for a pay-for-performance program that both Mark and Ben alluded to is trying to get them running in a within the deemed paradigm. So when you have your goals and your savings and everything is kind of built around the technology-specific widgets, there are some barriers that utilities are finding in terms of making sure that they can still get their performance incentives that might be based on deemed accomplishments, that they can claim actual load shape improvements that could maximize benefits versus having a fixed load shape. And some of those things are presenting some barriers for adoption, I think, or being able to innovate.
Thanks, Carmen. And our last question will be for Mark. Mark, have you or explored how you might combine data from the home energy score to inform outreach incentives our participants going forward in pay for performance?
Well, yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So the city of Portland has a mandatory home energy scoring ordinance for all homes that go up for sale. And I think that, I'm not recalling, I think our neighboring kind of city of Milwaukee, a suburb of Portland, adopted it, and it's coming up in other municipalities. And we are using that information now. That's a little different. We worked it out so that we could access that information and begin to follow up with those households with kind of targeted messaging based on, you know, the results of those home energy score data, which is warehoused and publicly available. It just took a little while for there to be agreement that yes, we could use it for program marketing purposes. So that is underway now, finally, this year. And I guess the delay is okay because it allowed time for more results to aggregate. So we are presently running campaigns to home energy score recipients in the city of Portland, and we will see how that goes later on this year. Of course, you know, clouded somewhat by some work stoppages, but I still think it'll yield some good results.
Thank you to the three of our panelists, Carmen, Ben, and Mark, for participating, and for our attendees who have went a little extra for us. It was a great presentation by all. Danielle?
Buttons get us all. Thank you. Yes, thank you all so much, and thank you, Commissioner Ogwin, for moderating a great Q&A. Just wanted to wrap up by announcing upcoming webinars. There is a special bonus webinar next week on participation in EarthX for Public Utility Commissions. And then our next Innovation Series webinar will be renewable technologies you may not have heard of. So we're talking about biomass, biofuels, and a few other technologies. And of course, NARUC's Summer Policy Summit will be virtual, July 20th to the 22nd. We encourage you all to join us. There will be lots of other great conversations and plenty of interactive Q&A. The presentation today has been recorded and will be posted to NERIC's website within about a week. We thank you all again for joining us and look forward to having you on our next webinar. Have a great week, everyone.